Thanks for inviting me to talk to you all today, and it's a real pleasure to be able to talk with you. So I'm going to give a brief summary of clinical trials testing new treatments for IgA nephropathy. I think it's fantastic that I'm leading on from the talks from John and Alex, which builds the background very nicely for this one. So just to give you some background, as we know, IgA nephropathy is the most common disease of the filters of the kidneys worldwide, primary glomerulonephritis. But although it's the commonest disease of this category, it's still considered to be a rare disease compared to, for example, heart disease, diabetes, cancers. And that probably goes to some way to explain why drug development has been fairly slow until very recently, as Alex alluded to in the last talk. And we also know that, unfortunately, there still is a risk of end-stage kidney disease or kidney failure that occurs in a subset of patients, in about a third of patients, by around 20 years of diagnosis. And our treatment options are still very limited in patients with high risk of progression. We use ACE inhibitors or angiotensin receptor blockers as first-line treatment, and many of you will be on those treatments. But the studies of other treatments, such as systemic steroids or other immunosuppressive drugs that have been used, the results of these studies have been inconsistent. There are significant side effects from using these treatments, which really prevents their long-term use. So there's a real need, as I'm sure you're all aware, in IgA nephropathy to develop new treatments. Unfortunately, as we've heard before, there are several now coming through. As mentioned previously, we know that the amount of protein that you leak from the kidneys into the urine is a key risk factor for kidney disease progression. So this graph here on the left shows survival from kidney failure, and these on the bottom are years from diagnosis. And we see that if your protein leak goes to above 1 gram a day, there's a much higher risk of progressive kidney disease and progression to kidney failure compared to if we can get that protein leak to less than 1 gram a day. And so the latest guidelines that John mentioned before from the 2021 KDIGA guidelines, which are international guidelines formed by a group of experts worldwide, states that all patients with a protein leak of over 0.5 gram per day should be treated with an ACE inhibitor or angiotensin receptor blocker. But what do we do if the protein leak remains above this, despite these measures? And in these guidelines, it's really been emphasized that we should consider enrollment into a clinical trial, because really the treatments beyond ACE inhibitors and angiotensin receptor blockers is not established. So this is a diagram of what we now know as the steps that cause IgA nephropathy. And we know that central to this is this increase in IgA molecules, the antibody, that in patients with IgA nephropathy lacks sugar residues from the hinge region, giving it a slightly different property that makes it more likely to form immune complexes with other antibodies, and makes it more sticky, that then gets trapped within the kidneys and deposits in the filters. This drives kidney damage and complement activation, leading to progressive kidney damage and injury. And we also know that this IgA seems to be coming from the mucosal immune system, and especially the gut. Unfortunately, there have been now a number of treatments that have been developed that target different steps in the disease process in IgA nephropathy. So this was a review written about 5 years ago, really highlighting the number of drugs that are targeting different steps in the disease process. And as John mentioned before, there are now over 20 different drugs being investigated for IgA nephropathy. And the good news is that many of these are in the late stages of clinical development. And one of these, as we've discussed, Nefecon, has now achieved a conditional approval and has been licensed for the use in patients with IgA nephropathy. So we've broken these down, these treatments into different categories, and I'll just briefly go through all of these different categories in the next few slides. I won't have time to mention all of these treatments individually, but we'll just talk about the groups in general. And I think, as Alex mentioned before, there are different phases of clinical trials, and the great news in these medications is that many of the drugs are now in the phase 2 or phase 3 of clinical trials, so just before being approved to be used. So I'll talk about Nefecon first, which is a drug that targets the mucosal immune system and in particular the gut. So Nefecon is a special form of steroid that has a special coating that allows it to be released in the part of the small bowel called the terminal ileum, and these are where collections of immune cells called Peyer's patches are located. And we believe these are responsible particularly for forming the form of IgA that's increased in IgA nephropathy and that then gets deposited within the kidneys. There was a phase 2 study called the NephIgAN study, where it was shown that patients treated with Nefecon with IgA nephropathy had significant reductions in the level of protein leak. And then work done by John and Karen's group in the lab as well was also able to demonstrate, importantly, that this drug was able to reduce this form of IgA, the galactose-deficient IgA, and also the immune complexes that get trapped within the kidneys. So this has now progressed to a phase 3 study called the NephIgAN study. And as we've heard before, in November last year, the top-line data was released, showing that this drug was able to significantly reduce protein leak and stabilize kidney function over a time period of 9 months in those treated with this drug. The follow-up data out to a 2-year time point is currently awaited, but on the basis of this initial data, this drug has now achieved approval from the US Food and Drug Administration for use in patients with IgA nephropathy, and it's currently undergoing the same process within Europe. The next class of drugs I'm going to talk about are drugs that target B cells. So B cells are special cells within the immune system, and they are responsible for producing antibodies such as IgA. And there are several drugs that have been developed within this field. And these drugs target cytokines or messengers within the blood that are responsible for the survival of B cells and also for promoting the formation of the abnormal form of IgA that we see in IgA nephropathy. So I've listed three examples of these drugs being developed one by Chinook, so Bion 1301 that was mentioned earlier, sibeprenlimab being developed now by Otsuka, and Atacicept being developed by Vera Therapeutics. These drugs are in slightly earlier stages of development compared to Nefecon, so they've been in smaller phase 1 and phase 2 studies. But the initial data that we're receiving so far is that this class of drugs is able to significantly reduce levels of this abnormal form of IgA, and also importantly lead to reductions in protein leak as well. It should be noted that this class of drugs can also lead to reductions in other normal immunoglobulins as well, which are responsible for forming antibodies. So far from the early data, it's shown that these drugs have been safe and well tolerated, but this emphasizes the importance of testing this in larger number of patients for safety. In Leicester, we're interested in another cytokine, another messenger that seems to be important in driving this abnormal form of IgA to be produced, called BAFF. We know that BAFF is increased in patients with IgA nephropathy and correlates and matches the amount of protein leak that there is. And interestingly, in a mouse model that has high levels of BAFF, if you look in their kidneys, you can also see IgA that's deposited. So we've partnered with GSK to look at a drug called belimumab, which is extensively used and is approved for use in patients with lupus. So we are looking at that in patients with IgA nephropathy in a randomized controlled trial in Leicester. We're recruiting adults with a GFR over 30 and protein leak over 0.5 gram per day. The next class of drugs I'm going to talk about are complement inhibitors. So the complement system is a part of your immune system that complements, so that's how the name arose, the antibody producing system. They're a group of proteins that are produced in the liver, and they help destroy bacteria and other foreign pathogens. But we do know that the complement system is also activated in IgA nephropathy, and perhaps that the complement system is recognizing the IgA that gets trapped and stuck in the kidneys and the filters, and then this complement drives inflammation and kidney damage in the kidneys. There's two main pathways that we believe are involved, which are the lectin pathway and the alternative pathway. This is a very complicated diagram of all these different proteins that are involved in complement pathways in black. But what I want you to focus on is the drugs that are in the blue circles. So we can see that there are now a number of drugs that are targeting the complement system at different parts of this pathway that have been developed, are being developed in IgA nephropathy. I'm going to focus on the top two, OMS721 and LMP023, as these are probably in the most advanced stages of development and are in phase 3 trials currently. So the first one, narsoplimab, or OMS721, is being developed by Omeros. This inhibits the lectin pathway. It's been studied in a phase 2 study just of 12 patients with IV treatment, weekly infusions, with an extended phase if patients continue to have a significant protein leak. And what was demonstrated in the initial studies was that there was a significant reduction in protein leak in those treated. And also, very interestingly, there's been long-term stabilization of kidney function out to 3 years in many of those treated. So this is currently recruiting as a global phase 3 clinical trial called Artemis-IgAN. The second trial of complement inhibitors I'm going to talk about is about iptacopan, which has been developed by Novartis. This has been studied in a phase 2 study, which was a dose-finding study to select the best dose for use in IgA nephropathy. And what they found was a dose-dependent reduction in protein leak, so that with patients treated with 200 milligrams twice a day, there was a significant reduction in protein leak after 90 days of treatment. So that's again given confidence to the company to expand this into a phase 3 clinical trial called Applause. That's another global study, and it's currently recruiting. The last class of drugs I'm going to talk about are modulators which don't affect the immune system, but are targeting more downstream pathways of the chemical pathways that may be activated when the IgA, after the IgA has been deposited within the kidneys. So we've heard about sparsentan before. So sparsentan targets both the angiotensin system, which is also targeted by ACE inhibitors or angiotensin receptor blockers, but also targets a very interesting pathway called the endothelin-1 pathway. And we know that in patients with IgA nephropathy, the endothelin-1 is increased and leads to a number of harmful effects, including vasoconstriction, so constriction of small blood vessels, causing increased blood pressure and increased pressure within the filters of the kidneys, but also seems to have specific effects on the cells within the kidneys that are affected in IgA nephropathy. So mesangial cells and podocyte cells, which are responsible for the filtration of proteins. So sparsentan's been developed that targets both the endothelin receptor responsible for this and the receptor, the angiotensin receptor that's targeted by usually by ACE inhibitors or angiotensin receptor blockers. And it's thought that the combination of this could be very beneficial for patients with IgA nephropathy. So that's been tested now in a global clinical trial. It's fully recruited 400 patients within this study. It's reached its interim endpoint, and as John mentioned before, there's it's been demonstrated that sparsentan demonstrated a significant reduction in protein leak compared to standard treatment with irbesartan, and this study is now in long-term follow-up. We've designed the SPARTAN study in Leicester to go alongside this study. We're looking for patients who are really at the early stages of diagnosis after IgA nephropathy within 6 months, who have not been treated with an ACE inhibitor or angiotensin receptor blocker. All patients within the study will be offered the drug. And really this study has been designed so that we can better understand how sparsentan is working. And although the sparsentan study has been fully recruited, there's also another study of a drug in this class called Atrasentan. This is in a phase 3 clinical trial called the ALIGN study. It's recruiting globally. This drug has been already tested in patients with diabetic nephropathy, so diabetic kidney disease, and shown to have a potential benefit there. So this is another very exciting study of a drug within this class. I'm going to mention SGLT2 inhibitors now. So some of you may be on this this form of drug already. Dapagliflozin is a drug that was initially developed for diabetes, but through its effects, it was also noted that this form of drug could also reduce the pressure within the filters of the kidneys and have potentially beneficial effects in patients with other forms of chronic kidney disease, especially those who are leaking protein. Within this study, there were a number of patients who had IgA nephropathy, and this group of patients were studied, and it was found that patients on dapagliflozin had a much lower risk of reaching this endpoint of kidney function decline, kidney failure, or death due to kidney disease or heart disease compared to the placebo group. There are some specific cautions about how to interpret this data. I think the most important one was that this study was not set up to study patients with IgA nephropathy, and therefore we can see those on the placebo had a very rapid rate of progressive kidney decline, and perhaps part of that reason was because the background therapy may not have been fully optimized. But this class of drug is also going to be tested in another trial called EMPA-KIDNEY, and the results of that study should be released later this year, and we should have a clearer picture after that. I'm finally going to touch on another study that we're doing in Leicester. So we're very interested in how the gut might interact with the mucosal immune system in IgA nephropathy, and especially the gut microbiome as well, and whether we can influence that to change some of this IgA production that's been formed in IgA nephropathy and alter the disease process. And there's now a number of lines of evidence that have highlighted a link between the gut and the kidneys in mouse studies and genetic studies, and also through the clinical trial that we discussed before, the Nephicon studies. And we know from small studies of patients with IgA nephropathy that those with progressive disease have a slightly different gut bacterial composition compared to those that don't have progressive disease or healthy subjects. So we're doing a study that's been funded by Kidney Research UK of a probiotic to see whether patients who are taking this probiotic, whether we can influence the IgA production. So we're looking for adult patients with a GFR above 45, no criteria on protein leak, but with no significant other gastrointestinal disease or autoimmune disease. So I'm going to stop there about the different drugs that are being developed. I thought I'd put some practical slides out now. So how do you find out more? I think the best source of contact would be to contact your local nephrologist or your kidney unit. Of course, either myself or John would be more than happy to be contacted as well about any of these studies. Here are some websites which I think are very useful. So there's the Be Part of Research.nihr.ac.uk. There's NephCure as well, and clinicaltrials.gov. So the first of these is Be Part of Research. If you type that into Google or your search bar, you can look at the disease you're looking for research about. So I've typed in IgA nephropathy there. You can type in your location, and then it will give you a list of the different trials going on, where they're taking part, and also give you some information about whether you may be eligible to enter into that study. The second website was NephCure, so the Kidney Health Gateway for that. Again, very similarly, you can type in your postcode, type in IgA nephropathy, and it will give you the number of trials there and some details about it. Clinical Trials is probably the most comprehensive of these. Again, you can type in your disease, location, and it will filter through where the study is taking place. And this is just a search I did earlier on, and if I typed in IgA nephropathy, I could find 150 studies taking place. Not all of these are interventional drug trials, but it really shows you how much research is going on in IgA nephropathy worldwide. So I hope that's been helpful. To summarize then, as we've discussed already, the treatment landscape, how IgA nephropathy is being treated is changing rapidly. And I think if we did this talk in maybe 2 or even 5 years' time, it would be a very different talk. We now have the very exciting development of the first approved treatment that's specific for IgA nephropathy, and we can see that many others are coming. But we still have a lot of work to do. So there remain several areas in IgA nephropathy where we do desperately need development of new drugs. So for example, in children, those with more advanced kidney disease with GFR less than 30, how do we treat patients who have recurrent IgA disease after kidney transplantation, patients who have this very rapidly aggressive course of IgA nephropathy where kidney function is falling dramatically, called crescentic IgA nephropathy, or the related condition called IgA vasculitis or Henoch-Schönlein purpura. So I'm going to finish there. Just thank you again for listening. A very big thank you to all our patients who are taking part in our clinical trials, which really has been key to advancing progress and our understanding in this area. I've left my contact details on the bottom left there if anybody's interested in getting in touch. This is a photo on a sunny day of our research team in Leicester, and thanks to our funders as well on the bottom right.